The night Silas Reed told her he would find a better woman by morning. Mika did not argue. She just stood there in the glow of the stove, one hand around a wooden spoon, and let the words land where they hurt most. Then the spoon slipped from her fingers. It struck the floor once. And before the next sunrise, his barn was burning. Riders were shooting through the dark, and the only reason Silas stayed alive was the woman he had just treated like something temporary. Mika had come to his ranch with dust in her hair, grief in her chest, and almost nothing left to lose. The winter before had emptied her life in stages. First the fever took her mother. Then it took her father before the thaw had fully broken. By spring, the land around her no longer felt like a place that remembered her people. Fences appeared where open ground had always been. Armed men spoke of ownership as if history began the moment they arrived. Families scattered. Fires grew smaller. Songs were no longer sung out loud. They were protected in whispers. Mika learned very quickly what hunger can do to pride. She was still young, but she no longer had the luxury of being young. A woman alone on the frontier did not need many mistakes to disappear. So when an old trader named Jonah Pike found her crouched beside a weak fire and told her of a rancher west of the river who needed a cook, she listened. He did not make the offer sound kind. He made it sound survivable. "The man's white," Jonah told her. "Keeps to himself. Works hard, talks less. Not mean from what I know, just hollowed out." That last part stayed with her. Hollowed out. It sounded like a warning. It sounded like recognition. A week later, the wagon left her at the edge of Silas Reed's land. The place looked like it had been standing against the wind for years out of sheer stubbornness. A low house leaned beneath a hard sky. The barn wore old storm scars. Fence lines stretched into pale distance where cattle drifted like dark stains on the grass. There was no nearby chimney smoke, no laughter, no sign that life gathered there once work was done. Then the front door opened. Silas stepped out with the stillness of a man who had already spent too many years speaking only to weather, animals, and memory. He was broad through the shoulders, sun-browned, rough-handed, and marked by the kind of labor that settles into bone. "You're the cook?" he asked. "Yes." He nodded toward the house. "Kitchen's through there. Small room in the back is yours. Do your work and we won't trouble each other." It was not a welcome, but it was a chance. So Mika took it. The first days were harder than the journey. The house was not dirty in the careless way. It was empty in the defeated way. Dust gathered where conversation should have lived. Cabinet handles hung loose. A curtain had torn and stayed torn because no one had cared enough to mend it. Mika scrubbed, repaired, cooked, restacked shelves, patched cloth, rendered fat, baked bread that made the kitchen smell alive again. Silas noticed more than he admitted. At first he ate in silence so complete it felt deliberate. He never praised her food, never lingered over conversation. Yet he started leaving better money for supply runs. He stacked extra wood near the kitchen door before cold evenings. He checked the lock twice each night without being asked. Little by little, protection began appearing in the shape of routine, and the house changed with them. Dust gave way to warmth. Stillness gave way to sound. Not loud sound, nothing dramatic, just the soft scrape of a chair after supper, the faint hum in Mika's throat when she thought no one could hear, the crackle of a longer fire, Silas pausing in the doorway for no reason except to remain where that warmth existed a little longer. Mika noticed him too. She noticed that he never shouted when a gate came loose, never drank himself cruel, never threw blame around to feel bigger. When something broke, he fixed it. When weather turned, he worked through it. When the day ended, he stood out in the yard staring toward the horizon like there were names out there he still had not buried properly. The ranch did not stop being lonely. It simply stopped being empty. And that was more dangerous. Because once two wounded people begin to matter to each other, fear stops sleeping. By late summer, the silence between them had grown gentler, but it had also grown heavier. It held things neither of them knew how to say. Micah had survived too much to trust safety quickly. Silas had buried enough loss to mistake distance for protection. Then the rumors started. Riders seen near the far trail. A small place east of town robbed clean. Someone's barn set ablaze in the night. The stories tightened something inside Silas. He checked the horses more often, slept lighter, kept his rifle within reach. And the more danger pressed at the edges of his land, the more he felt his attachment to Micah like a weakness someone could use against him. One evening, with the sky turning copper beyond the window, Micah stood at the stove stirring a pot of beans and venison. She was humming under her breath. It was the same quiet tune she used when the room felt safe. Silas came in, stopped behind her, and let fear do what fear does when it wants to survive before it wants to love. It made him cruel. "I won't keep you here long," he said. Micah went still. He swallowed, but the worst of him was already speaking. "I can replace you with someone better." The room changed in one breath. The spoon slipped from her hand and struck the floorboards. Once. Micah did not turn around. She did not ask what he meant. She did not give him the mercy of making him repeat it. After a long moment, she bent down, picked up the spoon, and said only, "Then I will be gone before sunrise." That night she packed in silence. She folded her spare dress, wrapped her small keepsakes in cloth, and sat on the narrow bed staring at the wall until tears came hard and soundless. Not because she had never been cast aside before, because this time, against her better judgment, she had started to believe she was no longer passing through someone else's life. Outside, the wind picked up. Then came the first gunshot. It split the night so sharply the house seemed to flinch. A second shot followed. Then a horse screamed. Then men shouting. Micah was on her feet before the third shot. By the time she reached the back door, the barn was already throwing sparks into the black sky. Flames ran up the side like they had been waiting for dry wood all season. Riders moved through smoke, firing wild and fast. Silas was behind the water trough with his rifle, returning fire toward the gate. He dropped one man. Then another shot found him. Micah saw the impact before she heard his voice. He staggered, one hand going to his side, and hit the dirt hard. A rider broke away from the others and started toward him to finish the job. Micah did not think. She moved. She snatched a burning timber from the collapsed rail, came out of the smoke like fury itself, and drove the flaming end into the man's shoulder and jaw. He reeled back, screaming. Before anyone else could see clearly through the fire, she dragged Silas by the arms across the yard, then into the cut of the hills beyond the ranch. He was half-conscious, heavy, bleeding badly. But Micah had grown up in a world where survival was taught in details outsiders never noticed. Which gully held shadow longest? Which ravine disappeared from horseback sight? Which cave mouth looked too narrow to matter unless you knew how to enter sideways? She got him into an old shelter her people had once used in bad weather, and hid there until the gunfire fell away behind them. For 3 days and nights, the world shrank to breath, blood, and firelight. Micah cleaned the wound with boiled water and bitter herbs. She held him upright when fever shook him. She gave him water, one swallow at a time. She spoke when the silence turned dangerous. Sometimes she told him stories from childhood, not because he could answer, but because a voice can pull a person back when pain is trying to carry him elsewhere. On the fourth night, Silas woke fully. The cave was quiet except for the hiss of embers. Micah had fallen asleep sitting against the stone wall, one hand still near the folded cloth she had used on his wound. For a long time he just looked at her, at the exhaustion on her face, at the soot still marking one side of her jaw, at the woman he had called Replaceable after she had hauled his bleeding body through fire to keep him alive. When she stirred, he said her name like it hurt. "Micah." She opened her eyes. "I didn't mean it," he said. Her expression did not change. "You said it." He shut his eyes for a moment. "I was afraid." She waited. "Not of you," he said, voice rough from thirst and shame. "Of needing you. Of losing you once I knew what this house had become with you in it." That was the first honest thing he had ever given her without being forced by disaster. Micah watched the fire for a moment before she answered. "Fear doesn't guard a life. It only empties it." Silas let the words settle. This time he did not defend himself. This time he understood that regret was not the same thing as repair. So when he was strong enough to stand, he did not ride back to the ranch merely to reclaim what had been attacked. He rode back to make a choice in daylight. He went first to 2 neighboring outfits for help tracking the men who had raided his land. Then he did something far harder than asking for guns. He rode with Micah to the scattered camp of her people. He stood where every wrong kind of man before him had expected obedience for free. And instead, he asked, not for labor, not for permission to take, for the chance to be judged truthfully. He told them what had happened. He told them what he had said. He told them who had saved his life. Then he said, clear enough for every person near the fire to hear, "I want to build a life with her, not as someone who serves my house, as the woman I will honor in it." There was anger there, and suspicion. There should have been. But there was also the fact that he had come wounded by his own shame and spoken plainly instead of hiding behind pride. On the frontier, truth had its own weight. The bandits were driven out 2 days later. Some were caught near the river crossing. One fled south. Another never made it out of the hills. Silas rode with neighboring ranchers, and men from Micah's people rode too. Not as followers, but as allies. That difference mattered more than any official victory. What happened after mattered even more. No one dragged Micah back to the ranch as hired help. No one decided her future over her head. No one called survival love and left it there. Silas asked again, this time to her, and this time with no fear hiding behind the words. The wedding happened under open sky. No church bell, no polished room, no spectacle. Just wind over grass, a small fire burning steady, her people watching, a few ranch hands standing back in respectful silence, and 2 people choosing each other without pretending the world had ever been gentle. The years that followed did not turn easy. They turned full. The house that had once felt abandoned began to hold noise the walls had never known how to keep. Boots by the door, bread cooling on the table, laughter crossing from the yard at dusk, children's voices breaking through morning air, a cradle by the bed, a second horse saddle made smaller, songs Micah refused to let vanish, lessons Silas taught with patient hands and no hardness in them. She was never the cook again. She was the center of the place. And Silas, who once believed distance could spare him pain, became the kind of man who stood in the doorway at sunset with a child on one hip and his wife beside him, and understood that love had not weakened his life, it had made one. Years later, when Spring Green returned to the fields and their youngest was sleeping inside after supper, he took Mika's hand and looked out across the land that had once seemed too wide for anything but loneliness. "I told myself I could replace you," he said. Mika looked at him, waiting. He smiled then, older now, humbler and certain. "But you were the one thing this place was missing before it ever knew my name." And for the first time since she had arrived with dust in her hair and grief in her chest, the land around her no longer felt borrowed. It felt like home, because it had finally become chosen.